Caleb Mercer saw his dead brother's eyes staring out from the face of a starving 7-year-old boy standing alone at the edge of his property. Then he noticed the crescent-shaped scar on the child's neck, identical to Daniel's, and every unanswered question from the past 8 years crashed into him at once. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The boy appeared on a Tuesday morning in late October, standing at the edge of Caleb Mercer's property like a ghost risen from the prairie dust. He was small for what Caleb guessed to be 7 or 8 years of age, dressed in clothes too thin for the season, his blonde hair matted and wild from days of travel. But it was his eyes that stopped Caleb cold in his tracks, made him drop the fence post he'd been carrying and stare at the child as if he were witnessing something impossible. Those eyes were the exact shade of gray-blue that Caleb had known his entire life, the color of storm clouds gathering over the Montana hills, the color that had belonged to only one person in this world: his brother Daniel. Dead these past 8 years, buried in a shallow grave somewhere in Kansas after a bank robbery gone wrong, or so the telegram had claimed. Caleb had never recovered the body, never had a proper funeral, never truly said goodbye to the younger brother he had raised after their parents died of fever when Daniel was just 4 years old. The rancher stood frozen in the morning light, his heart hammering against his ribs as the boy watched him with those impossible eyes. There was something else familiar in the child's face, too. Something in the set of his jaw, in the way he held himself despite his obvious exhaustion. Caleb had spent 38 years on this earth, the last 15 of them building this ranch from nothing but determination and hard work, and he had learned to trust his instincts about people and animals alike. His instincts were screaming at him now, telling him that this child's appearance was no coincidence. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of coming snow and the distant lowing of cattle in the north pasture. Caleb forced himself to move, to approach the boy with the same careful deliberation he would use with a spooked horse. The child didn't run, though his small body tensed with each step the rancher took. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking, more unsettling. It was like looking at Daniel as a boy, before the wildness had taken hold, before the gambling and the drinking and the desperate choices that had eventually led him down a path Caleb couldn't follow. "What's your name, son?" Caleb asked, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. The boy's chin lifted slightly, a gesture of defiance that sent another jolt of recognition through Caleb's chest. Daniel had done the same thing whenever anyone questioned him, that stubborn pride that had been both his greatest strength and his fatal flaw. "Elijah," the boy said quietly. "Elijah Mercer." The world seemed to tilt beneath Caleb's boots. Mercer. The boy carried his family name, Daniel's name, and by extension his own. Questions flooded his mind faster than he could sort through them. Daniel had never mentioned a wife, never spoken of children in the rare letters he'd sent over the years. But then Daniel had kept many secrets, had lived a life that Caleb had only glimpsed in fragments and rumors that drifted back to Montana from various towns across the frontier. "Where are your parents, Elijah?" Caleb asked, kneeling down to bring himself closer to the child's level. This close, he could see the dark circles under those familiar eyes, the hollowness in cheeks that should have been round with childhood health. This boy had been traveling hard and eating little, that much was clear. "Mama died last month," Elijah said, and though his voice remained steady, Caleb could see the grief swimming beneath the surface of his young face. "The fever took her. She told me to find you before she passed. Said you were my uncle. Said you'd take care of me if anything ever happened to her." Uncle. The word struck Caleb like a physical blow. Daniel had fathered a son, had married a woman, and created a family, and had never once mentioned any of it in the sporadic communications they'd maintained over the years. The anger that rose in Caleb's chest surprised him with its intensity. All those years of worrying about his wayward brother, all those sleepless nights wondering if Daniel was alive or dead, and the whole time there had been a child, a nephew, growing up somewhere, without any knowledge of the family that should have surrounded him. But the anger faded as quickly as it had come, replaced by something softer, as he looked at this exhausted, grieving boy who had somehow made his way across what must have been hundreds of miles of dangerous territory to find an uncle he had never met. The courage that must have required, the determination, the sheer stubborn will to survive. That was pure Mercer blood, no question about it. "You're telling me Daniel was your father?" Caleb asked, needing to hear it confirmed, needing to be certain before he allowed himself to believe what his heart was already accepting as truth. Elijah nodded, reaching into the worn satchel that hung across his thin chest. He pulled out a photograph, creased and faded from handling, and held it out to Caleb with a hand that trembled slightly. The rancher took it carefully, and his breath caught in his throat as he looked at the image captured there. Daniel, unmistakably Daniel, standing beside a pretty woman with dark hair and gentle eyes. Between them stood a smaller version of the boy before him, perhaps 4 or 5 years old in the photograph, with his father's arm around his shoulders. "He died when I was 5, Elijah said. "Mama said there was trouble, said some men came looking for him and he had to leave to protect us. He never came back." The official story had been a bank robbery, but Caleb had always suspected there was more to it than that. Daniel had gotten himself mixed up with dangerous men over the years, had made enemies in the kind of circles where grudges were settled with bullets rather than words. The idea that he might have been running, trying to lead danger away from his family, was both heartbreaking and somehow comforting. Perhaps in the end, Daniel had tried to do the right thing. Caleb looked up from the photograph, studying the boy's face with new intensity. And that was when he saw it, the scar that ran along the left side of Elijah's neck, pale and slightly raised against his sun-weathered skin. It was a distinctive mark, curved like a crescent moon, and Caleb had seen its twin 1,000 times before. He had been there when Daniel received that same scar at the age of 6, falling from a tree and catching his neck on a broken branch. Their mother had wept for hours, certain she would lose her youngest son, but Daniel had survived with nothing but that moon-shaped mark to show for his brush with death. The sight of that scar on this child's neck made everything suddenly, terrifyingly real. "That scar," Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you get it?" Elijah's hand moved instinctively to touch the mark on his neck, a gesture so unconscious and familiar that Caleb felt his heart clench. "Papa said I was born with it, said it was a family mark, that he had one just like it. Mama called it my angel's kiss. Born with it." The words echoed in Caleb's mind as he stared at the impossible evidence before him. Daniel's scar had been an accident, a childhood mishap that had left its permanent signature on his flesh. But here was the same mark on his son, appearing as if by some mysterious inheritance, some connection between father and child that defied explanation. Caleb had heard old stories about such things, wives' tales about marks passing from parent to child, about the bonds of blood manifesting in visible ways. He had never believed them until this moment. "Come inside," Caleb said finally, rising to his feet and extending his hand to the boy. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in weeks. We'll get you fed and warmed up, and then you can tell me everything." Elijah hesitated for only a moment before placing his small hand in Caleb's calloused palm. The touch sent another wave of emotion through the rancher, a fierce protective instinct that he hadn't felt since Daniel was young and dependent on him for everything. This child was blood, was family, was all that remained of the brother he had loved and lost. Whatever circumstances had brought Elijah to his doorstep, whatever dangers might follow in his wake, Caleb knew in that moment that he would protect this boy with his life. The ranch house was modest but well built, constructed from timber that Caleb had felled and shaped with his own hands over the course of 2 summers. He had designed it for a family that had never materialized, for the wife and children he had always imagined would fill its rooms with laughter and warmth. Instead, he had lived alone within its walls for more than a decade, the silence broken only by the occasional visit from neighboring ranchers or the hired hands who helped during calving season. Elijah's eyes widened as they stepped inside, taking in the stone fireplace, the sturdy furniture, the shelves lined with books that Caleb had collected over the years. "It's so big," the boy breathed, and Caleb realized with a pang that this child had probably never known anything but poverty, never experienced the security of a solid home. "It's yours now, too," Caleb said, guiding Elijah toward the kitchen, "for as long as you want it." He set about preparing food while the boy sat at the worn wooden table, his small frame seeming even smaller against the chair's broad back. Bacon sizzled in the pan, and Caleb cracked eggs with the practiced efficiency of a man long accustomed to cooking for himself. As he worked, he found himself stealing glances at his nephew, cataloging every feature that reminded him of Daniel and noting the differences as well. "Tell me about your mother," Caleb said as he set a plate before the boy. "What was her name?" "Sarah," Elijah replied, and the word carried all the weight of a child's grief. "Sarah Ann Mercer. She was a seamstress before she married Papa. She used to make the prettiest dresses for the ladies in town." Caleb tried to imagine it, his wild, reckless brother settling down with a seamstress, building a quiet life somewhere far from the trouble that had always seemed to follow him. It seemed so unlike the Daniel he had known, and yet perhaps that was the point. Perhaps Daniel had been trying to become someone different, someone better, for the sake of this woman and this child. "She sounds like a good woman," Caleb said softly. "She was the best." Elijah's voice cracked slightly, and he focused intently on his food, shoveling eggs into his mouth with the desperate hunger of someone who had learned not to take meals for granted. "She worked so hard after Papa left, took in mending and washing, anything to keep us fed. But then she got sick, and there was no money for a doctor, and she just kept getting weaker." The story was painfully familiar. Caleb had seen it play out countless times on the frontier, women worn down by hard labor and harder circumstances, their bodies giving out long before their spirits did. The injustice of it burned in his chest, the knowledge that somewhere out there, his brother's wife had died alone and struggling while he sat in comfort on his prosperous ranch, completely unaware that she or her son even existed. "How did you find me?" he asked. "Montana is a long way from wherever you came from." "Kansas," Elijah said between bites. "We lived in a little town called Redemption. Mama kept your letters, the ones Papa saved. She showed me where you lived on a map, made me memorize the route in case I ever needed to find you." The boy looked up, and those storm-gray eyes held a maturity that no child his age should possess. "She knew she was dying, I think. She had weeks to prepare me, to tell me everything I needed to know." The letters. Caleb remembered writing them, pouring his heart out to a brother who rarely responded, begging Daniel to come home, to leave behind whatever trouble he had found and return to Montana where he belonged. He had never known if those letters were read or simply discarded, had never received any indication that his words had meant anything to Daniel at all. But apparently they had been saved, treasured even, kept as a lifeline for a child who would one day need to find his way to family. "You traveled all that way alone?" Caleb asked, the enormity of it settling over him. "That's hundreds of miles through dangerous country." Elijah nodded, setting down his fork. "Mama said I was brave like Papa, said the Mercer men don't give up, no matter how hard things get." The words struck Caleb with unexpected force. He had said something similar to Daniel once years ago, when they were both young and the world seemed full of possibility. The Mercer men don't give up. It had been their father's saying, passed down like the ranch itself, like the determination that had kept their family rooted to this land through drought and hardship. "Your mama was right," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're brave as they come, Elijah, and you're home now." The first week with Elijah passed in a blur of adjustment and revelation. Caleb found himself reorganizing his entire existence around the presence of this small boy, shifting routines that had been set in stone for over a decade. He cleared out the spare bedroom that had served as storage, hauling boxes of old equipment to the barn and scrubbing years of dust from the floorboards. He purchased fabric from the general store in town and paid Mrs. Holloway, the minister's wife, to sew proper winter clothes for a child who had arrived with nothing but the threadbare garments on his back. The townspeople of Willow Creek watched these developments with undisguised curiosity. Caleb Mercer had been a fixture in their community for 15 years, known as a hard worker, a fair dealer, and a confirmed bachelor who seemed content with his solitary existence. The sudden appearance of a child in his care set tongues wagging from the mercantile to the church steps. Caleb ignored the whispers and the pointed questions, offering only the simple explanation that his nephew had come to live with him after being orphaned. The details of Daniel's life and death, the mysteries that still surrounded both, were not for public consumption. But in the quiet hours of evening, when Elijah had been tucked into his new bed and the house settled into stillness, Caleb found himself poring over the contents of the boy's worn satchel. Sarah Mercer had been thorough in her preparations, packing not only the photograph and Caleb's old letters, but also a collection of documents that painted a picture of Daniel's hidden life. There was a marriage certificate dated 9 years prior, signed in a small church in Missouri. There were Elijah's birth records, carefully preserved in oilcloth. And there was a letter, sealed and addressed to Caleb in Daniel's distinctive handwriting, that Sarah had apparently been instructed to include. Caleb held that letter for 3 nights before he found the courage to open it. When he finally broke the seal, his hands trembled as if he were handling something explosive, something that might destroy the fragile peace he had built in the years since accepting his brother's death. "Dear Caleb," the letter began, and even seeing his name in Daniel's script brought a lump to Caleb's throat. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and my boy has found his way to you. I know I have no right to ask anything of you after all the ways I've failed our family, but I'm asking anyway. Take care of Elijah. Raise him to be the kind of man you are, not the kind I became. He deserves better than what I could give him, better than the legacy of bad choices and broken promises that I've left behind." The letter continued for 2 more pages, filled with confessions and explanations that Caleb absorbed with growing understanding. Daniel had indeed gotten mixed up with dangerous men, had fallen into a scheme involving stolen money and powerful enemies who did not forgive betrayal. When the situation had become untenable, when it became clear that remaining would put Sarah and Elijah in mortal danger, Daniel had made the choice to lead the threat away from his family. He had known he was likely riding to his death, had accepted it as the price for their safety. "I never told you about them because I was ashamed," Daniel had written. "Ashamed of the life I was living, ashamed of the man I had become. Sarah saw something good in me, something I couldn't see in myself, and she gave me Elijah. That boy is the best thing I ever did, the only pure thing to come out of my wasted years. Please, Caleb, don't let my mistakes destroy his future. Give him the childhood I should have given him, the stability and love that our parents gave us before they were taken. Be the father I couldn't be." The letter ended with 3 words that blurred before Caleb's eyes. "I'm sorry, brother." He sat in the darkness of his kitchen for hours that night, grief and anger and love warring within him, until exhaustion finally won. Daniel had been a fool, had thrown away so much potential on reckless choices and desperate schemes, but he had also been brave in the end, had sacrificed himself to protect his family, had loved his son enough to plan for a future he knew he wouldn't see. It was a complicated legacy, neither wholly good nor entirely bad, and Caleb wasn't sure how to reconcile the brother he had known with the man revealed in these final words. Elijah seemed to sense the shift in his uncle's demeanor over the following days. The boy was remarkably perceptive, watching Caleb with those familiar gray-blue eyes that missed nothing. He asked no questions about the letter or the documents, though he surely knew they existed. Instead, he threw himself into learning the rhythms of ranch life, following Caleb through his daily chores with quiet determination. The child was a natural with the animals. Caleb discovered this on the morning he found Elijah in the barn, speaking softly to the most temperamental mare in the stable, a beast that had thrown more than one experienced handler. The horse stood perfectly still, her ears pricked forward with interest, as Elijah stroked her nose and murmured words too quiet for Caleb to hear. It was the same gift Daniel had possessed, the ability to calm even the wildest creatures with nothing but patience and presence. "She likes you," Caleb said, stepping into the barn and watching the mare nuzzle the boy's palm. "Animals are easier than people," Elijah replied without looking up. "They don't pretend to be something they're not." The observation carried weight beyond its years. and Caleb felt another pang of sorrow for all this child had witnessed and endured. 7 years old and already wise to the deceptions of the adult world, already armored against disappointment in ways that no child should need to be. "Some people are worth trusting," Caleb said gently. "It just takes time to figure out which ones." Elijah turned then, his gaze meeting his uncle's with searching intensity. "Did you trust my papa?" The question hung in the air between them. Caleb considered the question carefully before answering, knowing that whatever he said would shape this child's understanding of the father he had barely known. The easy response would be a simple yes, a comfortable lie that would preserve Daniel's memory and give Elijah something uncomplicated to hold on to. But Caleb had promised himself when he opened that letter that he would not perpetuate deception, that he would build his relationship with his nephew on a foundation of truth, even when the truth was difficult. "I trusted him to love me," Caleb said finally, settling onto a hay bale and gesturing for Elijah to sit beside of him. "I trusted that no matter what trouble he got into, no matter how far he strayed, he always cared about family. But I didn't always trust his judgment. Your papa had a way of seeing what he wanted to see, of believing things would work out, even when all the evidence pointed otherwise." Elijah absorbed this in silence, his small fingers still absently stroking the mare's velvet nose. "Mama said he was a dreamer, said that's what she loved about him, but also what made him dangerous to himself. Your mama sounds like she understood him well." Caleb felt a renewed respect for the woman he had never met, the seamstress who had somehow anchored his volatile brother long enough to create this remarkable child. Daniel was always chasing something, even when we were boys. He couldn't be satisfied with what was in front of him, always had to reach for something more. "Is that bad?" Elijah asked, and there was a vulnerability in the question that told Caleb this was really about the boy himself, about whether he had inherited his father's restless nature along with his eyes and his mysterious scar. "Not always," Caleb replied thoughtfully. "Dreaming is what makes people build new things, try new ideas, push beyond what everyone says is possible. But it becomes dangerous when you start believing the dream more than the reality, when you take risks that hurt the people who depend on you." He paused, searching for the right words. "Your papa learned that lesson too late, but the fact that he planned for you, that he made sure you could find me, tells me he understood in the end what really mattered." The mare whickered softly, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the barn. Elijah leaned into her warmth, and Caleb saw the tension slowly drain from the boy's narrow shoulders. These conversations were necessary, he knew, but they were also exhausting for a child still raw with grief. There would be time for more revelations later, when Elijah was stronger, when the wounds of loss had begun to heal. "Come on," Caleb said, rising and brushing hay from his trousers. "I'll teach you how to check the fence line. A rancher needs to know his boundaries." The days settled into a rhythm after that, each one bringing new lessons and small victories. Elijah learned to ride on a gentle gelding named Copper, his natural affinity for horses translating quickly into competence in the saddle. He learned to check cattle for signs of illness, to repair fencing with wire and post, to read the weather in the color of the sky and the behavior of the animals. Caleb found himself rediscovering his own work through the boy's eager eyes, remembering the wonder he had once felt at the vastness of the land and the satisfaction of building something lasting upon it. But the peace of those early weeks was destined to be interrupted. It came on a cold November morning when Caleb and Elijah returned from checking the north pasture to find a stranger waiting on the porch. He was a lean man with sharp features and cold eyes, dressed in clothes too fine for honest ranch work. A gun belt hung low on his hips, and his horse, tied to the porch rail, was a magnificent black stallion that spoke of money and power. "Caleb Mercer?" the stranger asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "That's right." Caleb positioned himself between the man and Elijah, every instinct screaming warning. "What can I do for you?" "Name's Silas Croft." The stranger's gaze slid past Caleb to rest on the boy, and something flickered in those cold eyes that made Caleb's blood run cold. "I'm looking for someone, a child actually, boy about 7 years old, traveling alone from Kansas. Word is, he might have ended up in this area. Caleb felt Elijah press closer to his back, felt the tremor that ran through the small body. Whatever this man represented, the boy recognized danger when he saw it. "Can't help you," Caleb said evenly. "Haven't seen any children matching that description." Silas Croft smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "That's interesting because the folks in town tell me different. Say you've got a nephew staying with you now. Boy who showed up a few weeks back, alone and orphaned." He stepped closer, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "Thing is, Mr. Mercer, that boy's father owed some very important people a great deal of money before he died. Those people don't forget debts, even when the debtor is no longer around to pay them. The sins of the father," Caleb said coldly, "don't pass to the son. Whatever Daniel owed, it died with him." "That's not how my employers see it." Croft's smile widened, became something predatory and cruel. "They see it as a matter of property. Daniel Mercer stole from them, and until that debt is settled, everything connected to him belongs to them, including his offspring." The words hit Caleb like ice water. These men, whoever they were, weren't just looking for money. They wanted Elijah himself, wanted to claim the child as collateral for a dead man's crimes. The obscenity of it, the sheer monstrous presumption, kindled a rage in Caleb's chest that burned away any pretense of civility. "You need to leave my property," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. "Now." Silas Croft did not move from his position on the porch. If anything, his posture became more relaxed, more confident, like a man who held all the cards and knew it. "I was hoping we could handle this like civilized men," he said, his tone almost regretful. "But I can see you're going to be difficult. That's unfortunate, Mr. Mercer. My employers don't appreciate difficulty. And I don't appreciate strangers threatening children on my land." Caleb's hand moved toward the rifle he kept just inside the door, a weapon that had served him well against wolves and the occasional rustler. "You have until I count to 10 to get on that horse and ride out of here. After that, I won't be responsible for what happens." Something shifted in Croft's expression, a flicker of reassessment. He was clearly a man accustomed to intimidation working in his favor, to people backing down when confronted with the implied threat of violence. Finding resistance where he expected compliance seemed to give him pause. "You're making a mistake," he said, but he was already stepping back toward his horse. "This isn't over. My employers have long memories and longer reach. They'll get what they're owed, one way or another." "Get off my land," Caleb repeated, and this time he did reach for the rifle, bringing it up with the smooth motion of long practice. "And tell your employers that if they want that boy, they'll have to go through me first." Croft mounted his black stallion with fluid grace, looking down at Caleb with an expression that promised future reckoning. "They'll take you up on that offer, Mr. Mercer. Count on it." He wheeled the horse around and rode away at a gallop, disappearing into the gray November landscape like a shadow retreating before light. Caleb stood watching until the rider was completely out of sight, the rifle still cradled in his arms. Only then did he turn to look at Elijah, who had pressed himself against the porch railing, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. The boy was trembling, not from cold but from the terror of having his worst nightmares confirmed. The men who had driven his father away, who had destroyed his family, had found him again. "Inside," Caleb said gently, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We need to talk." They sat at the kitchen table, the same place where Elijah had eaten his first meal in this house, where Caleb had begun to learn the shape of his nephew's life. But the warmth of those earlier conversations was absent now, replaced by the cold weight of danger pressing in from all sides. Caleb poured them both cups of hot coffee, more for the comfort of the ritual than any real need for the drink. "They found me," Elijah whispered, his hands wrapped around the warm cup but his eyes staring at nothing. "Mama said they might, said that's why she made me memorize the route, why she told me to travel at night and avoid the main roads. But I thought maybe, if I got far enough away, they would forget." "Who are they?" Caleb asked. "Who are these people your father owed?" Elijah shook his head slowly. "Mama never told me everything, just that Papa got involved with bad men when times were hard. that he thought he could make quick money and get out clean. But it doesn't work like that with people like them. Once they have their hooks in you, they never let go. The description matched what Caleb had pieced together from Daniel's letter and the fragments of rumor that had reached out to him over the years. His brother had always been susceptible to easy solutions, to the promise of fortune without the labor it usually required. It was a weakness that had caused problems even when they were boys, Daniel always looking for shortcuts, while Caleb did the hard work of keeping the ranch running after their parents' deaths. "They won't touch you," Caleb said firmly. "I don't care how powerful they think they are, how far their reach extends. You're my blood, my family, and I protect what's mine. But they'll come back." Elijah's voice cracked with the strain of holding himself together. "That man, he said they always get what they're owed. What if they hurt you trying to get to me? What if I'm the reason something happens to you, like I was the reason Papa had to leave?" The guilt in those words broke Caleb's heart. This child had been carrying the weight of his father's choices like a stone around his neck, believing himself somehow responsible for the tragedy that had befallen his family. It was a burden no 7-year-old should bear, a poison that would destroy him from within if left unchallenged. Caleb reached across the table and took Elijah's small hands in his own calloused grip. "Listen to me carefully," he said, holding the boy's gaze with fierce intensity. "Nothing that happened to your papa was your fault. Nothing. He made his choices long before you were born, got tangled up with these people through his own doing. The only thing you're responsible for is being brave enough to survive, strong enough to find your way here, good enough to deserve the life your mother wanted for you." Tears spilled down Elijah's cheeks, the dam of stoic endurance finally cracking under the pressure of Caleb's compassion. "I just wanted to find somewhere safe," the boy whispered. "Mama said you were safe, said you were the strongest, best man she knew of, even though she never met you. Papa told her stories about how you raised him after your parents died, how you always protected him, always forgave him no matter what he did." The revelation that Daniel had spoken of him with such admiration, had painted him as a hero to his wife and son, stirred complicated emotions in Caleb's chest. He had spent years feeling like a failure where his brother was concerned, unable to save Daniel from his own worst impulses, unable to bring him home when it mattered most. To learn that Daniel had seen him differently, had held him up as an example of what a good man should be, was both healing and heartbreaking. "You are safe," Caleb promised. "This is your home now, and no one is taking you from it." The days following Silas Croft's visit brought a new tension to the ranch, an undercurrent of vigilance that colored every moment. Caleb began wearing his pistol even during routine chores, something he hadn't done in years. He taught Elijah hiding places around the property, spots where a small boy could conceal himself if danger approached. The root cellar beneath the barn, the hollow space behind the woodpile, the dense thicket of willows along the creek where the branches grew so thick that even sunlight struggled to penetrate. "If you ever see strangers coming and I'm not with you, you hide," Caleb instructed during one of these lessons. "You hide and you stay hidden until I come find you or until you're certain they've gone. No matter what you hear, no matter what they say, you don't come out. Understand?" Elijah nodded solemnly, absorbing the instructions with the same serious attention he brought to everything. The boy had stopped asking if the bad men would return. He seemed to understand with the intuition of a child who had already lost too much that the question was not if, but when. Caleb made a trip to town the following week, leaving Elijah in the care of Mrs. Holloway with strict instructions that the boy was not to leave her sight for any reason. The minister's wife had proven herself trustworthy, a kind woman with no children of her own who had taken a grandmotherly interest in the orphaned newcomer. She asked no questions about the reasons for Caleb's sudden protectiveness, though her eyes were knowing when she promised to guard the child with her life. The sheriff's office sat at the end of Willow Creek's Main Street, a sturdy building that also served as the town's only jail. Sheriff Thomas Brennan had held the position for nearly 20 years, a gray-haired man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen enough trouble to recognize it in all its forms. He looked up from his desk as Caleb entered. his expression shifting from casual greeting to alert attention as he read something in the rancher's demeanor. "Caleb Mercer," Brennan said, gesturing to a chair. "You look like a man with something heavy on his mind. Sit down and tell me about it." Caleb recounted the visit from Silas Croft, describing the man, his threats, and the claims he had made about debts owed by Caleb's deceased brother. He held nothing back, laying out the full scope of the danger as he understood it. Sheriff Brennan listened without interruption, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. "I've heard of men like this Croft," the sheriff said when Caleb finished. "Collectors, they call themselves. Work for criminal organizations back east, tracking down people who've crossed their employers. They operate in the shadows, use intimidation and violence to get what they want. The law has a hard time touching them because they're careful to keep their hands technically clean." "What can I do?" Caleb asked. "I won't let them take that boy, Thomas. He's all I have left of my brother." Brennan leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "Legally, their claim is nonsense. A child can't be held responsible for his father's debts, and even if he could, you can't collect a debt through kidnapping. But these aren't people who care much about legal niceties. They'll take what they want and worry about justifications later. Then I need to be prepared to stop them." "You need to be careful," the sheriff corrected. "Men like Croft don't work alone. If his employers are serious about this, they'll send more than one collector. They'll wait until you're vulnerable, until the boy's exposed, and they'll strike fast." He paused, considering. "I can increase patrols near your property, keep an eye out for strangers passing through. But I can't station a deputy at your ranch permanently. I don't have the men for it." It was more than Caleb had expected, honestly. Rural law enforcement operated on limited resources, and the sheriff's willingness to help at all was a testament to the respect Caleb had earned in this community over 15 years of honest dealing. "I appreciate anything you can do," he said, "but I'm not going to sit back and wait for them to make a move. If they want to fight, I'll give them one." Brennan's eyes narrowed. "Don't go looking for trouble, Caleb. These people are dangerous, and they have resources you can't match. Your best protection is keeping that boy close and staying alert. The moment you see anything suspicious, you send word to me. We'll handle it together." The advice was sound, but it did little to ease the knot of anxiety in Caleb's chest. He had spent his adult life building something stable, something lasting, and now that stability was threatened by ghosts from his brother's past. The injustice of it burned, but anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. What mattered now was protecting Elijah, ensuring that Daniel's son had the chance to grow up that his father had sacrificed everything to provide. He stopped at the general store on his way back to Mrs. Holloway's house, purchasing additional ammunition and a few supplies that might prove useful if the ranch came under siege. The storekeeper, a gossip named Hutchins who knew everyone's business, raised an eyebrow at the purchases, but said nothing. Word would spread, Caleb knew. By nightfall, half the town would know that Caleb Mercer was preparing for trouble. Perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Perhaps a show of readiness would make Croft's employers think twice about the cost of pursuing their vendetta. Elijah was waiting on Mrs. Holloway's porch when Caleb arrived, his face lighting up with relief at the sight of his uncle. The boy had been brave during their separation, according to the minister's wife, but had spent most of the afternoon watching the road with anxious eyes. The bond between them had grown strong in the weeks since Elijah's arrival, forged in shared work and quiet conversations, and the unspoken understanding that they were all each other had. "Ready to go home?" Caleb asked, helping the boy onto Copper's back. Elijah nodded, his small hands gripping the saddle horn. "I missed the horses," he said, "and I missed you." The simple words carried more weight than any elaborate declaration could have managed. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a ferocity that kept even the most determined travelers off the roads. The snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing the ranch in white silence, transforming the landscape into something both beautiful and treacherous. Caleb found himself grateful for the weather, recognizing it as a temporary shield against the threat that lurked beyond the horizon. No collector, however determined, would risk the mountain passes in conditions like these. The enforced isolation gave him time with Elijah that felt almost normal, almost peaceful. They spent long evenings by the fire, Caleb reading aloud from the books that lined his shelves while the boy listened with rapt attention. They played checkers on a worn board that had belonged to Caleb's father, and Elijah proved to be a quick study, beating his uncle more often than not by the time Christmas approached. They talked about everything and nothing, building the foundation of a relationship that both of them needed more than they could express. Elijah began to open up about his life before, sharing memories of his mother in the small house they had shared in Kansas. He spoke of helping Sarah with her mending, of the garden they had tended together, of the bedtime stories she told about a brave uncle in Montana who would always keep him safe. The portrait that emerged was one of poverty, but also of love, of a woman who had stretched every resource to its limit to provide for her son. "She used to sing to me when I couldn't sleep," Elijah said one evening, his voice soft with remembrance. Songs about rivers and mountains and places far away. She said music was the only thing that couldn't be taken from you, no matter how poor you were. "Do you remember any of them?" Caleb asked. Elijah nodded slowly, then began to hum a melody that Caleb recognized with a start. It was an old song, one their mother had sung to him and Daniel when they were children, a lullaby about stars watching over sleeping babies. The fact that Sarah had known it, had passed it down to Elijah, meant that Daniel must have taught it to her. His reckless, wayward brother had carried that piece of their childhood with him through all his wanderings, had loved it enough to share it with his wife and son. "I know that song," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "My mother used to sing it too." The connection seemed to mean something profound to Elijah. His eyes widened, and a smile broke across his face that was rare and precious. "Really? Papa taught it to Mama. He said his mother sang it to him when he was scared." "She did, to both of us." Caleb found himself blinking back unexpected tears. "Your grandmother had the sweetest voice. She could calm any storm with her singing." They sat together in comfortable silence after that, the fire crackling and the snow falling softly against the windows, connected by a thread of melody that stretched back through generations. It was in moments like these that Caleb felt the full weight of what he had been given, not just the responsibility of protecting Elijah, but the gift of family restored after years of solitude. But winter could not last forever, and as February gave way to March, the snow began to melt, revealing the brown grass beneath and opening the roads to travel once again. With the thaw came renewed vigilance, a return of the tension that had marked those first weeks after Croft's visit. Caleb resumed his careful habits, never straying far from the house, keeping Elijah close, watching the horizon for signs of approaching riders. The attack, when it finally came, arrived not with obvious menace, but with calculated deception. It was a bright March morning, the air still cold but carrying hints of the spring to come. Caleb was in the barn repairing a broken harness when he heard the sound of approaching horses. He moved to the door, his hand resting on his pistol, and saw a wagon coming up the road with two men on the seat and what appeared to be a woman sitting in the back. They looked like settlers, ordinary people passing through on their way to somewhere else. The man driving the wagon raised a hand in friendly greeting, calling out a request to water their horses. It was a common enough occurrence on the frontier, travelers seeking basic hospitality from isolated homesteads. Caleb had provided such service dozens of times over the years without incident, but something felt wrong. The woman in the back sat too still, her posture rigid rather than relaxed. The horses pulling the wagon were too fine for simple settlers, their coats glossy with the kind of care that spoke of money and professional handling. And the men themselves, despite their rough clothing, had an alertness about them that seemed out of place for weary travelers. "Stay here," Caleb told Elijah, who had been helping with the harness. "Get to the hiding spot in the root cellar and don't come out until I call for you." "But Uncle Caleb—" "Now, Elijah." His voice carried an authority that left no room for argument. "Remember what I taught you." The boy's face went pale, but he obeyed without further protest, slipping through the back of the barn toward the concealed entrance to the cellar. Caleb watched him go, then turned back to face whatever was coming. He stepped out of the barn with his hand still on his pistol, forcing his expression into something that might pass for neighborly welcome. "Morning," the driver called out, pulling the wagon to a stop. "Hope we're not intruding. Been on the road since yesterday and our horses are about done in." "Water trough is around the side of the barn," Caleb replied, keeping his distance. "Help yourselves." The man smiled, but his eyes remained cold, assessing. "Much obliged. Name's Wilkins, and this here is my brother Pete. The lady is our sister Martha. We're heading to California to start fresh." It was a plausible story, delivered with practiced ease, but Caleb noticed that the woman had not looked up, had not offered any greeting of her own. "Your sister feeling all right?" Caleb asked, nodding toward the motionless figure. "She seems poorly." Something flickered in Wilkins's expression, a momentary crack in the pleasant facade. "Martha's just tired. Long journey and all. She'll perk up once we've rested a bit." The second man, Pete, had climbed down from the wagon and was leading the horses toward the water trough. His path took him past the barn door, and Caleb saw his eyes sweep the interior with quick professional assessment. He was looking for something, or someone. The realization crystallized into certainty in Caleb's mind. These men were not settlers. They were hunters, and their quarry was hiding beneath the barn floor. "That's far enough," Caleb said, his voice dropping the pretense of friendliness. His pistol cleared the holster in a smooth motion, leveling at Wilkins's chest. "I know what you are and why you're here. Turn that wagon around and leave my property." Wilkins' smile widened, becoming something predatory and cruel. "Now that's not very hospitable, Mr. Mercer. And here I thought you Montana folks prided yourselves on Western generosity. I'm generous with honest travelers, not with men who hunt children for profit." The facade fell away completely. Wilkins reached beneath his coat, but Caleb's pistol was already trained on him. "I wouldn't," the rancher warned. "I've killed wolves and rustlers on this land. Adding you to the list wouldn't trouble my conscience any." "You're outnumbered," Pete called from near the barn, his own weapon now visible. "Put the gun down and this doesn't have to get bloody." "The boy isn't here," Caleb lied, his mind racing through options. "I sent him away weeks ago, somewhere safe. You're wasting your time." "We know he's here." Wilkins' voice carried smug certainty. "We've been watching this ranch for days, waiting for the right moment. Saw the boy helping you in the barn not 10 minutes ago." He gestured toward the figure in the wagon. "Martha here, she's real good at looking harmless. Got us right up to your front door without you suspecting a thing." The woman finally moved, throwing off the shawl that had concealed her face. But it wasn't a woman at all. It was Silas Croft, his sharp features twisted into a satisfied smile. He held a rifle trained on Caleb, completing the triangle of threat that surrounded the rancher. "I told you we always collect what's owed," Croft said. "Should have listened when you had the chance. Now this is going to be unpleasant for everyone." 3 against 1, and Caleb knew he couldn't take them all. Even if he managed to shoot Wilkins, the other 2 would cut him down before he could redirect his aim. But surrender wasn't an option either. These men wouldn't leave witnesses, wouldn't risk Caleb raising the alarm after they took Elijah. They would kill him and take the boy, and everything Daniel had sacrificed would be for nothing. "You want the boy, you'll have to go through me," Caleb said, repeating the words he had spoken to Croft months ago, "and at least one of you won't survive the attempt." "Fair enough," Croft replied, raising his rifle. "We'll take those odds." The gunshot that rang out came from none of the weapons pointed at Caleb. It came from the barn, from a small figure who had emerged from the shadows with Caleb's spare rifle clutched in his trembling hands. The bullet struck Pete in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying into the mud. Elijah stood in the barn doorway, his face pale but determined, those storm-gray eyes blazing with the same fierce courage that had carried him across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory. The moment of stunned surprise gave Caleb the opening he needed. He fired at Wilkins, the bullet catching the man in the chest and dropping him from the wagon seat. Then he was moving, diving behind the water trough as Croft's rifle cracked and splinters exploded from the wood beside his head. "Run, Elijah!" Caleb shouted, but the boy was already in motion, darting toward the house with the rifle still clutched to his chest. Another shot from Croft went wide, kicking up dirt near the child's feet. Caleb rose from behind the trough and fired again, forcing the collector to duck behind the wagon for cover. Pete was struggling to his feet, clutching his wounded shoulder, but reaching for a knife at his belt with his good hand. Caleb shot him again, this time in the leg, and the man went down with a scream. It was brutal, but Caleb couldn't afford to leave enemies at his back, not with Elijah's life hanging in the balance. "Give it up, Croft," Caleb called, reloading with practiced speed. "Your men are down. This is over." "It's not over until I say it's over." The collector's voice had lost its smooth composure, cracking with frustration and rage. "Do you know who I work for? Do you have any idea what they'll do to you for this?" "I know what I'll do to you if you don't throw out that rifle and surrender." Caleb edged around the trough, trying to get an angle on Croft's position. "The sheriff knows about you, knows you're here. Whatever happens next, you're finished in this territory." A long moment of silence stretched between them, broken only by Pete's agonized moaning and the nervous whickering of the wagon horses. Then a rifle flew out from behind the wagon, landing in the mud with a soft thud. Croft emerged with his hands raised, his face a mask of cold fury. "This isn't over," he spat as Caleb approached with pistol leveled. "My employers will send more men. They'll never stop, not until they have what they're owed. Then I'll keep fighting until they run out of men to send." Caleb grabbed the collector by his collar, shoving him toward the barn. "Now move. You and your friends are going to enjoy the hospitality of Sheriff Brennan's jail." From the porch of the ranch house, Elijah watched with wide eyes, the rifle still gripped in his white-knuckled hands. He had disobeyed Caleb's instructions, had emerged from hiding when he should have stayed safe, and in doing so, he had saved his uncle's life. The ride into town was tense and silent, with the 3 wounded collectors bound in the back of their own wagon and Caleb driving with his pistol close at hand. Elijah sat beside him on the seat, still clutching the rifle that had changed everything. The boy had not spoken since the shooting stopped, his face locked in an expression that was far too old for his years. Caleb recognized that look. He had seen it in the mirror after his parents died, after he had been forced to become a man before he was ready. Sheriff Brennan met them at the edge of town, alerted by the sound of gunfire that had carried across the valley. His deputies took custody of the prisoners while the sheriff listened to Caleb's account of what had happened, his weathered face growing grimmer with each detail. When the story was finished, he looked at Elijah with something like wonder in his eyes. "You shot a grown man to protect your uncle," he said quietly. "That took courage, son." Elijah finally spoke, his voice small and uncertain. "I was scared, but I couldn't let them hurt him. He's all I have left." The simple words struck Caleb like a physical blow. Throughout the chaos of the attack, he had been focused on survival, on protecting the boy at any cost. He hadn't considered that Elijah might feel the same fierce protectiveness toward him, might be willing to risk everything for the family they had become to each other. "You did good," Caleb said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You saved my life out there. I'm proud of you." The tension in Elijah's small frame eased slightly at the words, though shadows still lingered in those familiar gray-blue eyes. Taking a life, even to save another, left marks on a person. Caleb knew that from his own experience, from the nightmares that still sometimes haunted his sleep decades after his first kill. He would need to help Elijah process what had happened, need to ensure that this day didn't poison the boy's future. Sheriff Brennan promised to send word to the territorial marshal about Croft and his employers, to pursue whatever legal avenues might put an end to the threat once and for all. It was more than Caleb had hoped for, though he knew that legal processes moved slowly and powerful men had ways of evading justice. The fight might not be over, but they had won this battle, and that counted for something. The ride back to the ranch was quieter still, both of them lost in their own thoughts as the horses plodded along the muddy road. The sun was setting by the time they arrived, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed incongruous after the violence of the morning. Caleb tended to the animals while Elijah sat on the porch, staring at nothing, still processing the enormity of what he had done. That night, Caleb found the boy in the barn, sitting beside the gentle mare he had befriended on his first morning at the ranch. The horse stood patiently, her nose resting on Elijah's shoulder, offering the wordless comfort that animals sometimes provide better than any human could. "Couldn't sleep?" Caleb asked, settling onto a hay bale nearby. Elijah shook his head. "Every time I close my eyes, I see it happening again. The gun going off, the man falling." His voice cracked. "I didn't want to hurt anyone. But when I saw them pointing their weapons at you, I just acted. I didn't even think about it." "That's called instinct," Caleb said gently. "Your body knew what needed to be done to protect the people you love. There's no shame in that." "But I shot someone." Mama always said violence was wrong, that good people find other ways to solve their problems. Caleb considered his words carefully before responding. "Your mama was right, mostly. Violence should always be the last choice, never the first. But sometimes, when evil men come with guns and bad intentions, the only way to stop them is to fight back. You didn't start what happened today. You just finished it." The boy was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently stroking the mare's neck. "Papa fought back too, didn't he? When those men came for him, he left to protect us, even though he knew it might kill him." "Yes," Caleb agreed. "Your father made a lot of mistakes in his life, but in the end, he chose to face the consequences of those mistakes rather than let them fall on you and your mother. That was courage, Elijah. The same kind of courage you showed today." "Do you think he would be proud of me?" The question carried all the weight of a child's desperate need for approval from a father he barely remembered. Caleb felt his heart clench at the vulnerability in those words, at the hunger for connection that no amount of time or distance could diminish. "I think he would be amazed by you," Caleb said honestly. "You survived things that would have broken most grown men. You traveled hundreds of miles alone, found your way to family you'd never met, and built a new life from the ashes of the old one. And today, you stood up against men who wanted to hurt the people you love, even though you were terrified." He reached out and placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Daniel would be proud. I know I am." Tears spilled down Elijah's cheeks, the emotional dam finally breaking after hours of stoic endurance. Caleb pulled the boy into his arms, holding him as he sobbed out all the fear and grief and relief that had been building since the morning's violence. The mare stood watch over them, her dark eyes calm and knowing, as if she understood that healing sometimes required this kind of release. "I don't want to lose you," Elijah whispered against Caleb's chest. "Everyone I love goes away. Mama, Papa, everyone. Promise me you won't leave." "I promise," Caleb said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "I'm not going anywhere, Elijah. This is our home, and we're going to build a life here together. No one is taking that away from us." They stayed in the barn until the moon rose high, finding comfort in each other's presence and the patient companionship of the horses. When they finally returned to the house, Elijah fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted by the day's ordeal. Caleb sat by his bedside long into the night, watching over his nephew, this miraculous gift from a brother he had thought lost forever. Spring came fully to Montana that year with a gentleness that felt like grace. The snow retreated to the highest peaks, wildflowers carpeted the meadows in brilliant color, and the cattle grew fat on the lush new grass that covered the rangeland. Caleb watched the transformation of the land with a heart that felt lighter than it had in years, as if the season's renewal had touched something deep within him as well. Word came from Sheriff Brennan in late April that Silas Croft had turned informant, trading testimony against his employers for a reduced sentence. The territorial marshal had used that testimony to dismantle the criminal organization that had haunted Daniel's memory and threatened his son. Arrests had been made in 3 states, assets seized, operations shut down. The shadow that had followed Elijah across hundreds of miles of frontier had finally been dispelled by the light of justice. Caleb read the letter aloud to Elijah as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over their land. The boy listened with solemn attention, and when Caleb finished, a long breath escaped his small frame, as if he had been holding it for months. "It's really over?" Elijah asked, his voice carrying a fragile hope that he seemed almost afraid to trust. "It's really over," Caleb confirmed. "Those men will never threaten you again. You're safe, Elijah, truly safe." The smile that broke across the boy's face was radiant, transforming his features with a joy that Caleb had rarely seen in the months since his arrival. It was the smile of a child who had been carrying an impossible burden and had finally been allowed to set it down. The sight of it filled Caleb with a fierce, protective love that still surprised him with its intensity. They had settled into a rhythm of life that felt natural and right. Elijah attended the small school in Willow Creek, walking the 3 miles each way with energy and enthusiasm. His teacher, a young woman named Miss Catherine Walsh, sent regular notes praising the boy's intelligence and curiosity. He was making friends among the other children, learning to be a normal boy after too many years of fear and hardship. At home, Elijah continued to develop his gift with horses, working alongside Caleb to train the young colts that would eventually be sold to ranches across the territory. The mare he had befriended on his first day remained his special companion, and he had named her Sarah after his mother. Caleb understood the significance of that choice, the way it allowed the boy to keep his mother's memory close even as he built a new life. The scar on Elijah's neck had become less mysterious to Caleb as the months passed. He had stopped trying to explain it rationally and had simply accepted it as a sign, a mark of connection that linked his nephew to the brother he had lost. Whether it was coincidence or something more profound, it served as a constant reminder that family bonds transcended the ordinary boundaries of the world. On a warm evening in May, Caleb took Elijah to visit Daniel's grave. They had created a memorial on the hill overlooking the ranch, a simple wooden cross with Daniel's name carved into it. There was no body beneath the marker, but the gesture mattered nonetheless. It gave them a place to honor the man who had fathered one of them and been brother to the other. "I wish I remembered him better," Elijah said, kneeling before the cross. "Sometimes I try to picture his face, but it's all blurry now, like looking at a photograph that got wet." Caleb knelt beside him, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "That's natural. You were very young when he left, but you carry him with you in other ways. In your eyes, your courage, the way you are with horses. Daniel lives on through you, Elijah. That's what family means." The boy reached up to touch the scar on his neck, the gesture unconscious and familiar. "Mama said this was proof that I belonged to Papa's family, that even if we got separated, this mark would show who I really was." She was right. Caleb's voice was thick with emotion. "The moment I saw that scar, I knew you were my blood. It was like seeing Daniel again, like getting a piece of him back that I thought was lost forever." They sat together in comfortable silence as the stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had watched over generations of Mercers on this land. Caleb thought about his parents, about the legacy they had left behind, about the responsibility he now carried to pass that legacy on to the next generation. It was a weight he welcomed, a purpose that gave meaning to all the years of solitary labor. "Uncle Caleb?" Elijah's voice was soft in the darkness. "Yes? Thank you for not giving up on me, for fighting for me when you didn't even know me." The words pierced Caleb's heart with their simple sincerity. "You're my family, Elijah. I would have fought the whole world for you if I had to." "I know." The boy leaned against his uncle's side, his small body warm and trusting. "That's why I'm not scared anymore, because I know you'll always be there." They walked back to the house together, the moonlight silvering the path before them. The ranch spread out around them in peaceful beauty, the buildings and fences and pastures that represented a lifetime of work. But it no longer felt like a solitary achievement. It was a home now, a place where a family lived and laughed and loved each other. In the kitchen, Caleb heated water for tea, while Elijah set out the cups with practiced ease. They had developed their own rituals over the months, small routines that bound them together as surely as blood ever could. The boy who had appeared like a ghost on an October morning had become the center of Caleb's world, the unexpected blessing that had filled an emptiness he had not even known he carried. "Same time tomorrow?" Elijah asked as they settled into their chairs, the tea steaming between them. Caleb smiled, reaching across to ruffle the boy's hair. "Same time every day, for as long as we both shall live." Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon, vast and challenging and full of promise. And in a modest ranch house beneath the Montana stars, an uncle and his nephew sat together, bound by blood and choice in a love that had been tested by fire and found strong enough to last a lifetime.